The government just crossed a line this week that they haven't crossed since World War II, and they buried it in a press release hoping you wouldn't notice. You should notice, because the last time this happened, it took 30 years and a complete restructuring of the global financial system to clean it up. This time, there is no cleanup plan. There is only a reset. And most Americans have absolutely no idea it's already been decided. Let me tell you exactly what just happened, exactly why it is more serious than anything you have heard from mainstream financial media this week, and exactly what the people who understand monetary history are doing right now to protect themselves. Because there is still time, but the window is not permanent. And based on where the numbers are moving, it is closing faster than most people realize. Here is the number they buried. America's public debt has now officially surpassed the size of the entire United States economy. In technical terms, the debt to GDP ratio has crossed 100%. What that means in plain language is this: every single dollar of economic activity that takes place in the United States in one full year, every paycheck cashed, every product sold, every service rendered, every business transaction completed across every industry in every state, all of it added together is no longer enough to cover what this country owes. We are spending more than we make as a nation, and the gap is not shrinking. It is accelerating every single month. Now here's where the press release version of this story ends and the real story begins. Because the figure being reported in the headlines, the $31.27 trillion they are comparing to GDP, is not the complete picture. Not even close. That number represents only what is called debt held by the public. That is the debt owed to external holders, foreign governments, pension funds, bond investors around the world, institutional buyers who purchased U.S. Treasury bonds expecting to be paid back in full with interest. That is the number the headlines are using. But when you include the debt the U.S. government owes to itself, to the Social Security Trust Fund, to federal employee pension programs, to internal government accounts, the actual total federal debt is sitting at $39.2 trillion. And when you measure that against GDP, you are not looking at 100% debt to GDP. You are looking at 124%. 124 cents owed for every single dollar this economy produces in a year. And climbing. This is the number they did not put in the headline. This is the number they were hoping you would not do the math on. And this is the number that credit rating agencies, the institutions whose entire professional purpose is to tell the world whether U.S. debt is trustworthy, are now being forced to confront. Because you cannot look at 124% debt to GDP on a trajectory that is moving in one direction and tell the world with a straight face that this is the safest debt on the planet. You cannot, and some of them are finally starting to stop pretending. Let me explain why credit ratings matter to your life directly, because this is where most financial content loses people in abstraction. Think about your own credit score. When your personal credit score is high, you get favorable terms. Lower interest rates on your mortgage. Better rates on your car loan. More access to credit when you need it. When your score drops, everything gets more expensive. The interest goes up. The terms get worse. The doors that were open start closing. Countries operate on exactly the same principle. The United States used to hold a perfect credit rating, AAA, the highest possible designation. The signal to every bond buyer, every foreign government, every institutional investor in the world that U.S. debt was the gold standard of safety, guaranteed to be paid back, guaranteed to hold its value, the most trustworthy financial instrument on earth. That was the AAA promise. That promise has already been broken once. A few years ago, under the weight of exactly the debt trajectory we are talking about today, a major credit agency did something that would have been considered unthinkable a generation earlier. They downgraded the United States from AAA to AA. And in the world of sovereign debt, in the world of global bond markets, where the entire system of international finance is built on the assumed safety of U.S. Treasury bonds, that downgrade was not a clerical adjustment. It was a statement. The statement said, out loud and on the record, that the United States is no longer the safest bet in the world. And now in the direct aftermath of debt crossing 100% of GDP, with the full picture sitting at 124%, more agencies are signaling publicly that a second downgrade may be unavoidable. Not theoretical. Not distant. Unavoidable given the current trajectory. Here is what that second downgrade does to your life. When the U.S. government needs money, which is every single day, it issues Treasury bonds. It says to the world, lend us money today and we will pay you back with interest over 10, 20, 30 years. The interest rate on those bonds, the yield, is essentially the price the United States has to pay to borrow money. Right now, the yield on the 30-year Treasury bond is sitting at approximately 5%. Now, 5% might not sound alarming on its own. Many of you remember yields being at 10, 12, 13% in the 1980s. So why is 5% a crisis today when it wasn't then? Here is exactly why. In 2007, the last time yields were hovering near this 5% level, the total national debt was $8.8 trillion. Today it is $39.2 trillion. 4.5 times larger. Same interest rate applied to 4.5 times the debt. The math on what that does to the annual interest payment is not complicated. The United States is now spending more money every single year just servicing the interest on its debt than it spends on the entire defense budget. More than every aircraft carrier, every military base, every weapons program, every defense contract combined. Just the interest. And every time yields move higher, every time a credit downgrade makes U.S. debt less attractive and forces the government to offer higher yields to find buyers, that interest bill grows. On a debt that is already 4.5 times what it was the last time we were at this yield level, this is the trap. And it is a trap that closes tighter with every passing month. Because here is what happens when the interest payments get too large to manage through conventional means. The government faces 3 options. Option 1, cut spending dramatically enough to bring the debt under control. That means cutting Social Security, Medicare, defense, federal programs that tens of millions of Americans depend on. It is politically catastrophic, and no administration has been willing to do it. Option 2, raise taxes significantly enough to close the gap between revenue and spending. Also politically catastrophic. Also something no administration has been willing to sustain at the scale required. Option 3, keep borrowing. Keep printing new dollars to cover the gap, and allow the currency itself to absorb the cost of the debt through inflation. This is the option that has been chosen. This is the option that is always chosen by every government in every country that has reached this level of debt in recorded history. Because option 3 transfers the cost to ordinary citizens gradually and quietly without requiring any politician to stand up and announce that they are making your savings worth less. They never make that announcement. They just do it. And most people never connect the rising price of groceries, the rising cost of rent, the shrinking purchasing power of their paycheck to a deliberate policy decision made in their name without their understanding or consent. This is what I want you to understand with complete clarity before we go any further. What is happening to the dollar right now is not accidental. It is not an unfortunate side effect of complicated economic forces beyond anyone's control. It is a choice. A repeated, deliberate, institutional choice to protect government borrowing capacity at the direct expense of your purchasing power. Economists call it inflation. Financial commentators call it monetary policy. I am going to call it exactly what it is. It is a stealth default. And it is happening to you right now today, whether you are paying attention to it or not. Here's what stealth default means in concrete terms. Default means you borrowed money and you did not pay it back in full in real terms. A conventional default is obvious. A country misses a payment. Bond markets panic. Headlines scream. But a stealth default is invisible by design. In a stealth default, the payment arrives on time. The number on the check is exactly correct. Nominally, you are being paid back in full. But the purchasing power of the dollars you are being paid back with has been quietly, systematically eroded since the day you lent them. If you lent the U.S. government $100 10 years ago and they hand you back $100 today, the transaction looks clean. The numbers match. But that $100 today buys approximately $70 worth of what it bought a decade ago. You lent them $100 of real purchasing power. They handed you back $70 of real purchasing power. They never missed a payment, and they defaulted on you anyway. That is a stealth default. And it is not a fringe economic theory or a conspiracy. It is basic math applied to documented inflation data over documented time periods. The theft is real. The mechanism is legal. And it has been running continuously for decades, accelerating each time the debt grows and the pressure to print intensifies. Now let me show you where this leads. Because this is not a story without a destination. The path the United States is on has been traveled before, not in ancient history, not in some distant civilization with no relevance to modern life. In living memory, in countries with functioning stock markets and middle classes and banking systems and people who checked their investment accounts on their phones and felt, right up until the moment everything changed, the same kind of background confidence in their financial system that most Americans feel right now. I am talking about Argentina. I am talking about Venezuela. I am talking about Lebanon. And I am talking about what daily life actually looked like in those countries when the math caught up with the policy. In Argentina in 2012, there was a functioning middle class. People had mortgages. They had retirement savings. They had bank accounts they had spent their entire working lives building. They had financial advisors telling them everything was basically fine, just stay the course, trust the system. By 2023, inflation in Argentina hit 211% annually. 211%. Families that had done everything right, saved consistently, invested responsibly, lived within their means, watched the savings of 30 years become essentially worthless within a span of months. Not because they made bad decisions, because the government made the decision to print its way out of its debt. And ordinary people exactly like you, absorbed the entire cost of that decision through the destruction of their purchasing power. In Venezuela, the currency collapsed so completely and so rapidly that physical bolivar notes became worth less than the materials required to print them. People used them as wallpaper, not as a metaphor. Literally as wallpaper, because buying actual wallpaper cost more than the face value of the money required to buy it. In Lebanon, banks simply froze accounts. People with real savings, documented savings, money they had deposited and expected to be able to access could not get to it. The system seized, and the people who had kept all of their wealth inside that system had no recourse and no alternatives. Every single one of those countries had people inside them, educated people, people who read the news and followed the markets and considered themselves financially aware, who said it could never happen here, who believed their country was different, who believed their institutions were strong enough, their economy large enough, their currency established enough that the kind of collapse happening in other places simply could not reach them. They were wrong. And the mechanism that proved them wrong is the same mechanism that is running inside the United States economy right now. Debt beyond the capacity of the economy to service it. A government choosing currency devaluation over fiscal discipline. Credit agencies beginning to signal that the debt is no longer unquestionably safe. And a population that is largely unaware of the sequence that is already underway. The sequence matters. This is the piece that most financial content skips entirely, because understanding the sequence is what separates people who see this coming and position themselves accordingly from people who are blindsided by it when it arrives. Monetary collapses do not happen randomly. They do not happen without warning. They happen in stages, and those stages follow a pattern that is consistent across countries and across centuries of financial history. The pattern is not a secret. It is documented. It is studied. And it is currently visible in the data coming out of the United States economy if you know what you are looking at. Stage 1 is the slow burn. This is the phase most Americans have spent their entire lives inside without recognizing it for what it is. Government spending consistently exceeds revenue. The gap is covered by issuing more debt. The central bank keeps interest rates artificially suppressed to make that debt manageable. Inflation runs at a low enough level that most people feel its effects, but don't identify them as the systemic problem they represent. Your rent goes up. Your groceries cost more. Your paycheck buys slightly less each year than it did the year before. But none of it crosses the threshold of alarm. None of it feels like a crisis. It feels like just how things are. This is stage 1, and it is designed to feel normal, because if it felt like the emergency it actually is, the political pressure to change course would be impossible to ignore. The slow burn keeps the pressure below the threshold of public reaction, while the underlying imbalance compounds year after year after year. Stage 2 is acceleration. This is where the slow burn begins feeding on itself. Debt levels reach the point where even historically low interest rates cannot keep the interest payments manageable. The gap between what the government takes in and what it spends grows faster than economic growth can close it. And the government faces the choice we discussed in part 1, the politically painful choice or the money printer. They choose the money printer, every time, because the people making that choice are not the ones who pay the price for it. You are. When they choose the printer, new dollars enter the system. More dollars chasing the same amount of goods means each dollar buys less. That is inflation. Not the academic definition, the lived experience version, the version where you walk into the same grocery store you have been going to for 10 years, buy the same things you always buy, and your total at the checkout is 20, 30, 40% higher than it was 3 years ago. The version where your salary goes up 3% and your cost of living goes up 8% and you are working harder and falling further behind at the same time, and you cannot quite identify why. That is stage 2, and that is where the United States is right now. The Federal Reserve's own preferred inflation measure, the PCE price index, has been running above its stated 2% target for years. And that 2% target deserves a moment of direct commentary because it is one of the most successful pieces of financial misdirection in modern economic policy. The Federal Reserve has told the American public that 2% annual inflation is not just acceptable, but necessary and desirable. Think about what that actually means. It means the institution responsible for managing your currency has officially declared that your money is supposed to lose 2% of its purchasing power every single year, indefinitely by design. At 2% annual inflation, the dollar loses half its purchasing power in 35 years. If you are 30 years old today and you retire at 65, the dollar you hold today will be worth less than 50 cents in retirement, at the Fed's own stated target. That is the best-case scenario they are promising you. The scenario where everything goes according to plan, the scenario where the acceleration stays controlled, the debt trajectory somehow stabilizes, and the decades of compounding imbalance resolve themselves without a critical threshold event. That best-case scenario still cuts your purchasing power in half over a working lifetime. And based on where the debt levels are, where the credit ratings are heading, and what history tells us about governments at this stage of the debt cycle, the best-case scenario is not the one the data is pointing toward. Stage 3 is what monetary historians call the critical threshold. This is the inflection point. The moment where the math stops being a slow-moving problem and becomes an acute crisis. The trigger is almost always confidence. Not economic data. Not a single policy decision. Confidence. At some point, enough of the major holders of U.S. debt, the foreign governments, the sovereign wealth funds, the large institutional investors who have been buying Treasury bonds for decades on the assumption that they represent the world's safest asset, start asking a question they were previously willing to suppress. Is this still safe? Is the purchasing power of the dollar still reliable enough that the yield I am receiving actually compensates me for the risk I am taking? When enough of those holders start moving toward the exit, the demand for U.S. debt falls. When demand falls, the government must offer higher yields to attract the buyers it needs. Higher yields on $39 trillion of debt generate an interest bill that is already larger than the defense budget and grows larger with every basis point of yield increase. To pay that larger interest bill, the government borrows more. More borrowing means more currency creation. More currency creation means more inflation. More inflation means more holders of U.S. debt questioning whether the real return on their investment is actually positive, which means more movement toward the exit, which means demand falls further, which means yields have to go higher again. This is the feedback loop that ends currencies. This is the exact mechanism that played out in Argentina, in Venezuela, in Lebanon, in Weimar Germany, in every major currency collapse in documented history. And the signals that it is approaching, the credit downgrades, the elevated yields, the debt to GDP crossing 100%, the accelerating inflation, are not hypothetical warning signs from a future that might or might not arrive. They are present tense data points from an economy that is already in stage 2 and showing the early indicators of stage 3. The question is not whether the threshold exists. The question is how far away it is. And the honest answer, based on the current trajectory, is closer than the mainstream financial media is telling you. Now let me tell you what this means for your money specifically, because this is where abstract macroeconomics becomes personal. If you are holding the majority of your savings in cash or cash equivalent accounts, savings accounts, money market funds, short-term bonds, you are already losing ground. At current real inflation rates, money sitting in a traditional savings account earning 1 or 2% interest is losing 3 to 5% of its real purchasing power every year. You are not protecting your wealth. You are watching it erode in a way that is invisible on your account statement because the nominal number stays the same or grows slightly while the real value shrinks consistently. Your statement says you have $10,000. It does not tell you that $10,000 buys significantly less than it did 3 years ago and will buy significantly less again 3 years from now. If your retirement savings are heavily weighted toward US dollar-denominated assets, traditional bonds, fixed income instruments, cash positions, you are exposed to exactly the risk we have been describing. A currency that is being systematically devalued by the government issuing it on a trajectory that the debt levels and credit signals suggest is going to accelerate, not stabilize. And if your income is entirely in dollars and you have not taken any steps to hold assets that exist outside the dollar system, your entire financial position is dependent on the government managing this situation in a way that protects your purchasing power. Based on everything we have walked through today, that is not where the evidence points. So what do? What have people done throughout history when they recognized they were inside stage 2 of a currency cycle with stage 3 indicators beginning to appear? The answer is not complicated. It is not glamorous. It has been called old-fashioned by the same financial establishment that is currently presiding over a debt-to-GDP ratio of 124%. The answer is gold. And before that triggers a dismissive reaction, I want you to sit with one data point. In the last 5 years, gold has moved from approximately $1,900 per ounce to over $4,600 per ounce. That is more than 2.5 times your starting position in 5 years. In that exact same 5-year period, the purchasing power of the US dollar declined by approximately 30%. If you held dollars over the last 5 years, you lost nearly a third of your real purchasing power. If you held gold over the last 5 years, you more than doubled what you had in real terms. That is not a fringe outcome. That is not luck. That is gold doing exactly what gold has done throughout every period of currency stress in recorded history, preserving real purchasing power when paper currency cannot. And here's the critical point that most people miss when they look at gold's recent performance. What we have seen in the last 5 years is gold performing during the slow burn and early acceleration phases. Stage 1 and Stage 2. What happens to gold during Stage 3, during the critical threshold, during the currency reset, is a completely different magnitude. In every documented currency collapse, gold has been the asset that allowed the people who held it to come through the other side with real wealth intact. Wealth they could use to acquire assets at reset prices. Wealth they could exchange for property, for businesses, for productive resources, at the moment when everything that was previously overpriced became available at a fraction of its former value because the people selling it desperately needed something real. The people who held their savings in the currency that collapsed had nothing real to exchange. They were starting over. The people who held gold were not. This is not a theoretical historical curiosity. This is a documented pattern across dozens of currency crises in modern history, in living memory, in countries that had people inside them who felt, until the very end, that their institutions were strong enough to prevent exactly what happened. Gold has no counterparty risk. It is not a promise. It is not a bond that depends on the issuer's ability and willingness to pay. It is not a bank deposit that depends on the bank remaining solvent and the government not freezing accounts. It is the asset itself. It has been money across every civilization for 5,000 years. Every fiat currency ever created in human history, without a single exception, has been either significantly devalued or has collapsed entirely.